Bienvenidos a la profecía. En este video nos sumergiremos en el oscuro y perturbador mundo de uno de los asesinos en serie más infames de la historia, Ted Bundy. Durante décadas, los horribles crímenes de Ted Bundy han capturado la atención del público y han generado debates en torno a la naturaleza del mal y la psicología criminal. En esta primera parte nos sumergiremos en los primeros años de Ted Bundy, sus primeros crímenes y las señales de alarma que surgieron a su alrededor. Exploraremos el impacto que tuvo en las víctimas y sus familias, así como el legado del terror que dejó a su paso. Además, investigaremos los esfuerzos de las autoridades para capturarlo y llevarlo ante la justicia. Sin embargo, les adelanto que esta es solo la primera parte de nuestra investigación. En la segunda parte, nos sumergiremos aún más en la mente de Ted Bundy, desentrañaremos sus tácticas de seducción y manipulación, y exploraremos su vida en prisión y su controvertida ejecución. Así que prepárense para una experiencia llena de suspenso, misterio y revelaciones impactantes. Les aseguramos que esta serie les dejará con muchas preguntas y reflexiones sobre la naturaleza humana y la oscuridad que puede esconderse tras una apariencia aparentemente normal. Los primeros años de Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy nació el 24 de noviembre de 1946 en Burlington, Vermont. Durante su infancia aparentaba ser un niño común y corriente. Sin embargo, detrás de esa fachada aparentemente normal se escondían los primeros signos de perturbación que se desarrollarían más adelante en su vida. Algunos expertos han sugerido que los primeros años de Ted Bundy estuvieron marcados por factores que podrían haber influido en su futuro comportamiento criminal. Se ha especulado sobre posibles traumas, disfunciones familiares y eventos perturbadores que podrían haber desencadenado su lado oscuro. A medida que Ted Bundy crecía, comenzaron a surgir preocupantes indicios de su personalidad retorcida. Era descrito como un joven solitario, introvertido y obsesionado con la violencia. Sin embargo, su inteligencia y apariencia carismática le permitieron ocultar su verdadera naturaleza a los demás. Durante sus años de juventud, Ted Bundy demostró ser un estudiante talentoso y ambicioso. Incluso fue aceptado en prestigiosas instituciones educativas, lo que despertó expectativas de un futuro prometedor. Pero, lamentablemente, esos logros académicos se vieron eclipsados por una oscuridad interna que gradualmente emergía. A medida que avanzamos en la historia de Ted Bundy, veremos cómo los eventos de su pasado se entrelazan con su camino hacia la violencia y el asesinato. Exploraremos en detalle cómo sus experiencias tempranas pueden haber sido catalizadores para su retorcida transformación. Aunque Ted Bundy aparentaba ser un hombre encantador y respetable, tras esa máscara de normalidad se ocultaba un depredador despiadado. En la década de 1970, cometió una serie de brutales asesinatos en diversos estados de Estados Unidos. Ted Bundy eligió cuidadosamente a sus víctimas, a menudo mujeres jóvenes y atractivas. Las secuestraba, torturaba y finalmente las asesinaba de manera brutal. Su modus operandi era meticuloso y planificado, lo que le permitía evadir la captura durante años. A medida que los crímenes de Ted Bundy se multiplicaban, las autoridades comenzaron a notar patrones y señales de alarma. Testimonio de testigos presenciales, evidencia forense y análisis psicológicos se convirtieron en elementos clave para vincular los casos y acercarse al asesino. Sin embargo, Ted Bundy era un maestro en el arte de la manipulación. Utilizaba su encanto y su inteligencia para evadir sospechas y confundir a los investigadores. Se disfrazaba de persona respetable y se mezclaba con la sociedad, ocultando su siniestro secreto a la perfección. A medida que la presión sobre Ted Bundy aumentaba, las autoridades intensificaron sus esfuerzos para capturarlo. Perfiles psicológicos, técnicas de investigación innovadoras y una colaboración interjurisdiccional fueron clave para acercarse al elusivo asesino en serie. A medida que la lista de víctimas de Ted Bundy aumentaba y la presión sobre las autoridades crecía, la cacería del asesino en serie se intensificó. Finalmente, en 1978, Bundy fue arrestado por los cargos de asesinato, secuestro y violación. Los juicios de Ted Bundy se convirtieron en eventos de gran repercusión mediática y captaron la atención de todo el país. Durante el proceso legal, Bundy utilizó su carisma y su habilidad para representarse a sí mismo, desafiando a los fiscales y manipulando a la opinión pública. A pesar de su defensa y sus intentos de evadir la responsabilidad, Ted Bundy fue finalmente declarado culpable y condenado a muerte por sus terribles crímenes. Sin embargo, su historia no terminaría ahí, ya que su legado y su impacto continúan resonando en la sociedad actual. Los juicios de Ted Bundy arrojaron luz sobre la complejidad de la mente de un asesino. Plantearon preguntas sobre la naturaleza del mal y la capacidad humana para cometer actos de violencia extrema. Su caso se convirtió en un estudio de referencia en el ámbito de la psicología criminal. La mente de Ted Bundy ha sido objeto de intensos debates y análisis por parte de expertos en psicología criminal. Se ha especulado mucho sobre los factores que pudieron haber contribuido a su transformación en un asesino en serie. Desde su infancia hasta su vida adulta. Algunos sugieren que Bundy pudo haber experimentado traumas o disfunciones durante su desarrollo, lo que podría haber influido en su comportamiento violento. Otros argumentan que su personalidad narcisista y su capacidad para manipular a las personas fueron factores clave en sus acciones. La mente de un asesino en serie como Ted Bundy es un enigma complejo y perturbador. Su capacidad para ocultar su verdadera naturaleza detrás de una apariencia encantadora y su habilidad para seleccionar y cazar a sus víctimas sin ser detectado han dejado perplejos a investigadores y profesionales de la psicología. Los crímenes de Ted Bundy han dejado una profunda huella en las comunidades afectadas y en el imaginario colectivo. Las víctimas y sus familias han sufrido un dolor inimaginable y su memoria vive en el corazón de quienes las amaban. Pero el legado de Ted Bundy no se limita a sus víctimas directas. Su caso ha tenido un impacto duradero en la cultura popular, criminología y la conciencia pública sobre la existencia de los asesinos en serie. Su nombre se ha convertido en sinónimo de maldad y depravación. Aunque Ted Bundy fue ejecutado por sus crímenes en 1989, su legado sigue siendo objeto de fascinación y estudio. Su perfil psicológico y su modus operandi han servido de base para numerosas investigaciones y han contribuido a nuestro entendimiento de la psicopatía y la criminalidad. Los crímenes de Ted Bundy dejaron a numerosas familias destrozadas. La pérdida de un ser querido en manos de un asesino es una tragedia inimaginable, y las heridas emocionales son profundas y duraderas. A lo largo de los años, las familias han luchado por encontrar justicia, sanar y reconstruir sus vidas. Su valentía y perseverancia merecen ser reconocidas, ya que han sido voces incansables en la búsqueda de la verdad y la memoria de sus seres queridos. La búsqueda de Ted Bundy fue una operación policial compleja y desafiante. A medida que los crímenes se acumulaban y se revelaba la verdadera magnitud de sus acciones, los esfuerzos para capturar al asesino se intensificaron. Investigadores de diferentes jurisdicciones trabajaron en colaboración, compartiendo información y pistas para tratar de dar con la ubicación de Bundy. La tecnología forense y los perfiles criminales fueron herramientas clave en la identificación y seguimiento del asesino. Finalmente, la captura de Ted Bundy en 1978 marcó el fin de una cacería que había mantenido en vilo a la nación. Sin embargo, su arresto fue solo el comienzo de un proceso legal y judicial que desvelaría más detalles sobre sus crímenes y su perturbadora psicología. Durante los juicios de Ted Bundy fue sometido a un riguroso escrutinio por parte de los fiscales y los expertos forenses. A medida que se presentaron pruebas y testimonios, se desvelaron detalles perturbadores sobre sus crímenes y su comportamiento sádico. Las revelaciones sobre la verdadera naturaleza de Ted Bundy dejaron a muchos atónitos. Su capacidad para ocultar su lado oscuro y su habilidad para manipular a quienes lo rodeaban resultaron inquietantes y perturbadoras. Además, se descubrieron secretos oscuros relacionados con su vida personal de Ted Bundy, sus relaciones tumultuosas, sus desviaciones sexuales y su doble vida como asesino en serie.
Klein. Count 2, murder in the first degree, to wit, Margaret Bowman. Count 3, murder in the first degree, to wit, Lisa Levy. Count 4, attempted murder in the first degree, to wit, Karen Chandler. Count 5, attempted murder in the first degree, Kathy Klein. Count 6, burglary of a dwelling and assaulting a person therein, to wit, Cheryl Thomas. Count 7, attempted murder in the first degree, to wit, Cheryl Thomas. After the defendant was adjudicated guilty by the court in each count, which the court has previously adjudicated in each count of the indictment, and the trial jury, after hearing additional matters, rendered and considered an advisory sentence pursuant to Florida Statute 921-141, 3. The jury returned and an open court recommended that this court impose a death sentence upon the defendant Theodore Robert Bundy for the murders of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy. The verdicts were returned recommending death in both counts. This court, independent of, but in agreement with, the advisory sentence rendered by the jury, does hereby impose the death penalty upon the defendant Theodore Robert Bundy in 2 separate and distinct murders, murder in the first degree. In support thereof, as required by 921.141, 3, will submit, when final, prepared, the following written findings upon the death of each victim. In order to avoid duplicity, where applicable, the findings of aggravated circumstances will be stated as applicable to both counts. Separate enunciations will be made in those aggravated circumstances which were singularly applicable to the particular crime. Aggravation. A, that the crime for which the defendant is to be sentenced was committed while the defendant was under sentence or imprisonment. Finding of the court that the defendant stipulated that he was under sentence of aggravated kidnapping in the state of Utah, which had not been served, pardoned, or paroled, and that is applicable to both counts. B, that at the time of the crime for which he is to be sentenced, the defendant had been previously convicted of another capital offense or a felony involving the use of threat or violence to some person. The defendant stipulated that he had been convicted of the crime of aggravated kidnapping in the state of Utah, and that it was a crime involving the use of threat or violence to the person, which is applicable in both counts. C, that the defendant, in committing the crime for which he is to be sentenced, knowingly created a great risk of death to many persons. Finally, the defendant entered a sorority house where 30 more girls lived, killed 2 and attacked 2 more. Every girl in the house was a potential victim and threatened. However, the court does not find any evidence of attack on any other girl or entry into any other room. Therefore, this aggravated factor is not proved to this court's satisfaction beyond and to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt. The crime for which the defendant is to be sentenced was committed while the defendant was engaged in the commission of or attempt to commit any robbery, rape, arson, burglary, kidnapping, or aircraft piracy, or the unlawful throwing, placing, or discharging of a destructive device or bomb. Finding the capital felonies committed in this case were committed while the defendant was engaged in the commission of the crime of burglary. That is applicable to both counts 2 and 3. The capital felony was committed for the purpose of avoiding or preventing an unlawful arrest or effecting an escape from custody. There is no evidence of any aggravating factor, therefore the same is not applicable. The capital felony was committed for pecuniary gain. There is no evidence of this aggravating factor, therefore the same is not applicable. The capital felony was committed to disrupt or hinder the lawful exercise of any governmental function or the enforcement of the laws. There's no evidence of this aggravating factor, therefore the same is not applicable. The capital felony was especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel. As to Margaret Bowman, count 2 in this information, the court finds that the victim was a young girl in a college at the Florida State University, a member of Chi Omega sorority, living in the sorority house and asleep in her bed. The defendant stealthily bludgeoned and pummeled her with an object later described by identifying witness as a log or club of rough texture. She was struck several times about the head. She had a ligature around her neck, which was a pantyhose that strangled her and caused her death. The beating was vicious, vile, and wicked and atrocious. Indeed, the testimony showed that the frontal area of the brain of the skull was fractured, jagged, and exposed a portion of the brain. She was left in her own bed in a pool of blood. Her body was mutilated and lifeless. As to count 2, the indictment, the court finds that the victim was a young girl in college at Florida State University, a member of the Chi Omega sorority, living in a sorority house asleep and in her bed. The defendant, while the victim was in her bed, was stripped of her night clothing. One nipple was incised and bit off. There was also a bite mark on her left buttocks. There was evidence of vaginal and anal trauma, and she was left in a pool of blood in her own bed, her body mutilated and near death. She expired a very short time later. The court finds that both of these killings were indeed heinous, atrocious, and cruel, in that they were extremely wicked, shockingly evil, vile, and the product of a design to inflict a high degree of pain and utter indifference to human life. Now, the defendant chose to offer no evidence of any of the enumerated statutory mitigating factors, but chose instead to offer evidence to show that the defendant in the future could be rehabilitated and serve as a useful purpose for the rest of his natural life. This court declined to hear testimony concerning character of the death penalty, as it has been totally and completely considered by the Supreme Court of Florida and by the Supreme Court of the United States. Matters offered in rehabilitation were of a variety of witnesses: Catholic priests, ministers of Christian faith, his mother, and a journalist. The court has carefully considered all the evidence offered by the defendant and has further considered the total record in the case. The court declined to enter said writ because the court knows not where the defendant might be assigned in the schedule of the Department of Corrections, but offered, with the state's agreement, proffer of the testimony that the defendant might function as a law librarian. This the defendant declined. However, the court will consider this as a consideration in mitigating factors. Prior to the closing of the defendant's evidence in mitigation, the court inquired as to whether the defendant had been informed in counsel on each and every mitigating factor in the statute, but was tersely and disrespectfully informed that the conversation between counsel and defendant were privileged and that no meaningful response was given to the court's question. The court further considered the psychiatric report filed in this cause by Dr. Hamilton of Detroit, Michigan, a diplomat of the American Board of Psychology and Neurology. The course of the mitigation testimony shown by the defendant was calculated and deliberately designed to evade any reference in this court's mind of the statutory mitigating factors to be presented to the jury. However, this court is going to consider each and every one separately and independently in the discharge of its duties and consider the same in light of the total record that is before us. The court has considered no evidence or factors in imposing the penalty herein, and has no information not disclosed to the defendant or his counsel which the defendant has not had an opportunity to explain or deny. See Gardner versus State of Florida and the respective sites. Mitigating circumstances. This defendant has no significant history of prior criminal activity. Finally, this circumstance has not been established, as the record shows that the defendant was convicted of the crime of aggravated kidnapping, extradited to Colorado, and escaped while awaiting trial in the state of Colorado. The capital felony was committed while the defendant was under the influence of extreme mental or emotional disturbance. There is no evidence of any extreme mental or emotional disturbance at the time of the commission of the acts. That the victim was a participant in the defendant's conduct or consented to the act. There's no evidence that either victim in this case consented or was participating in the act. That the defendant was an accomplice in the offense for which he was to be sentenced, as was an accomplice in the offense for which he is to be sentenced, but the offense was committed by another person and the defendant's participation was relatively minor. There is no evidence that anyone other than the defendant participated in the offense. All the evidence is to the contrary. The defendant acted under extreme duress or under substantial domination by another person. This mitigating factor is the element of substantial domination of another person is not applicable. However, the extreme duress element will be discussed by the court simultaneously with mitigating factor F, the defendant's capacity to appreciate the criminality of his act, of his conduct. The capacity of the defendant to appreciate the criminality of his conduct or conform his conduct to the requirements of the law was substantially impaired. The psychiatric evaluation report of Dr. Tanay, previously filed in this cause and considered by the court in a competency proceeding, indicated that the defendant makes decisions based upon distorted perceptions of reality. And due to the behavior of the defendant, it appears accurate to say that he attempts to conceal and reveal his involvement simultaneously. That is, dealing with the criminal justice systems are dominated by psychopathology. This court has carefully considered this report in an attempt to determine if the defendant possessed an impairment of his ability to appreciate the criminality of his conduct, or whether the perception of an extreme duress is within himself. This court is of the opinion that while the pathological needs for the defendant are consistent with defiance of authority and manipulation of all people that he contacts, as the report states, there is no overall symptomology of a personality disorder or substantial impairment of ability for the defendant not to appreciate the criminality or to establish the presence of extreme duress. This court has observed the demeanor and the actions of the defendant throughout this entire trial. And while a number of incidents appear antisocial, they do not, in this court minds, indicate or demonstrate a reduction of appreciation by the defendant of the criminality of his act. I find there are no mitigating circumstances in either circumstance E or F. The age of the defendant at the time of the crime finding. The defendant is now 32 years of age. There is no mitigating factor. The crime occurred January 15, 1978. Upon the preceding specific findings of fact, the court bases its sentence. It is of the opinion of this court that there are sufficient aggravating circumstances existing to justify the sentence of death. The aggravating circumstances are so clear and convincing that virtually no reasonable person could differ. The court is mindful that the sentence must be a matter of reasoned judgment rather than an exercise in discretion. It is this court's reasoned judgment that no mitigating circumstances, either statutory or by the testimony presented in the advisory sentence proceedings, which have been proven to this court, or exist to impair the thrust of the aggravated circumstances which have been proven to this court beyond and to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt. This court therefore agrees and concurs with the advisory sentence in the recommendation entered by the trial jury. It is therefore the sentence of this court, count 2 of the indictment, you, Theodore Robert Bundy, be adjudicated guilty of murder in the first degree, and that you be sentenced to death for the murder of Margaret Bowman. As to count 3 of the indictment, you, Theodore Robert Bundy, be adjudicated guilty of murder in the first degree, and that you be sentenced to death for the murder of Lisa Levy. It is further ordered that you, Theodore Robert Bundy, be taken by proper authority to the Florida State Prison, and there be kept and closely confined until the date of your execution is set. It is further ordered that on such scheduled date that you be put to death by a current of electricity sufficient to cause your immediate death, and such current of electricity shall continue to pass through your body until you are dead. The death sentence is imposed in both counts 2 and 3 for the deaths of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, independently and separately. You're notified, sir, that a judgment of conviction and sentence of death under the law of Florida is automatically and will be fully reviewed by the Supreme Court of Florida. As to counts 2 and 3, the court has previously announced. As to count 4, attempted murder in the first degree, this court is the opinion that the underlying felony in this count is indispensable to count 1, and the court will impose no sentence. Count 6, burglary of a dwelling and assaulting a person therein. The court sentences you to 99 years in the state penitentiary. That is consecutive to the sentences that are imposed by this court in counts 1, 2, and 3. Count 7 of the information, attempted murder in the first degree. This underlying felony in this count is indispensable. As to count 6, and the court will impose no sentence on the previous authority. All sentences imposed on counts 1, 2, 3, and 6 are consecutive. This court also invokes Chapter 78 through 18, now 947.16 of the Florida statutes. That is to say that the court retains jurisdiction over the offender for review of any future release order for the Florida Parole and Probation Commission for 1/3 of the total consecutive sentences imposed in this case. The court finds that ample justification exists for the entry of an order by this court retaining jurisdiction over Theodore Robert Bundy for review of any further release order of the Florida Parole and Probation Commission, in this regard specifically finds that these crimes involved a burglary of a sorority house with 30 or more girls, wherein 4 were brutally beaten and with 2 being killed. That the girls in the sorority house no way participated in the suggestion of or consented to the entry for criminal acts. One case involved the entry into a private home, and one count wherein the sleeping victim, also a young girl. The defendant has a history of prior criminal activity. These crimes committed involved extreme savagery, indifference of human lives, and the infliction of agony and pain upon the helpless young women. The defendant has maintained a complete indifference to the commission of these acts. You have the right to appeal within 30 days from the date of these proceedings. You're further advised that you have a right to the assistance of counsel in the filing and preparation of your appeal. Upon your request and showing that you're entitled to an attorney at the expense of the state, an attorney will be appointed to represent you. This order is done and ordered in open court in Miami-Dade County, Florida, this 31st day of July, 1979, AD.
Thank you.
I say that to you sincerely. Take care of yourself. It's a tragedy for this court to see that such a total waste, I think, of humanity that I've experienced in this court. You're a bright young man. You made a good lawyer. I'd love to have you practice in front of me, but you went another way, partner. Take care of yourself. I don't have any animosity to you. I want you to know that. Take care of yourself.
Thank you.
Court will be in recess. Remain seated, please, till the judge is out of the courtroom.
Y honrar su memoria. El juicio final de Ted Bundy fue uno de los eventos más seguidos por los medios de comunicación de la época. La atención mundial se centró en las declaraciones finales, las pruebas presentadas y las deliberaciones del jurado. A pesar de los esfuerzos de la defensa por negar su culpabilidad, Bundy fue condenado por múltiples cargos de asesinato y sentenciado a la pena de muerte. Su caso se convirtió en un ejemplo emblemático del sistema judicial y sus implicaciones en los casos de asesinos en serie. El 24 de enero de 1989, Ted Bundy fue ejecutado en la silla eléctrica. Su muerte marcó el fin de una era y el inicio de un legado duradero que sigue generando interés y debate en la sociedad. Aunque Bundy ya no está vivo, su impacto no desapareció. Su historia continúa fascinando a investigadores, psicólogos y aficionados al crimen, quienes buscan desentrañar los secretos de su perturbadora mente y comprender qué llevó a cometer tales actos atroces. El legado de Ted Bundy ha dejado una huella indeleble en la cultura popular. Su historia ha sido objeto de numerosas obras literarias, películas y documentales que buscan arrojar luz sobre su compleja personalidad y los crímenes que cometió. Ted Bundy se convirtió en un caso de estudio para psicólogos y criminólogos interesados en comprender las motivaciones y los perfiles de los asesinos en serie. Su comportamiento perturbador y su habilidad para ocultar su verdadera naturaleza plantean preguntas importantes sobre la psicología humana y los factores que llevan a la violencia extrema. A partir del caso de Ted Bundy se han desarrollado teorías y metodologías para identificar y prevenir la aparición de futuros asesinos en serie. Los investigadores han examinado patrones de comportamiento, antecedentes familiares, traumas infantiles y otros factores que podrían influir en la aparición de estas personalidades violentas. Los estudios sobre la mente de Ted Bundy han arrojado luz sobre la complejidad de la psicopatía y la capacidad de manipulación de estos individuos. Su habilidad para engañar y seducir a sus víctimas ha sido objeto de análisis y debate en la comunidad científica. El legado de Ted Bundy en la psicología criminal es innegable. Su caso ha influido en la forma en que los profesionales abordan el estudio de los asesinos en serie y ha contribuido al desarrollo de perfiles criminales más sofisticados. Pero vamos, dime lo que piensas. Si te ha gustado este video, no olvides darle like, compártelo para que más personas conozcan esta inquietante historia. Suscríbete para que nuestro canal siga creciendo y podamos traerte cada vez mejor contenido paranormal y terrorífico. Por último, haz clic en la campanita para que seas de los primeros en recibir nuestras notificaciones. Y si quieres saber más sobre el tema de este video, visita nuestra página web. Allí encontrarás un artículo más extenso sobre el tema. No olvides seguirnos en todas nuestras redes sociales. Encontrarás los enlaces en la caja de descripción. Allí compartimos contenido diverso y de último momento en relación a sucesos paranormales y asesinatos inquietantes. Hasta la próxima.